Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Stern, and I'm the director and CEO of the Fritz Usher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. We research, discuss, publish, and exhibit artists whose life and work were affected by the German Nazi regime between 1933 and 1945. Gustav Metzger was a visionary artist and radical thinker. His legacy is profoundly rooted in activism in both the political and artistic realms. And I quote, "At the beginning, I was confronted with a choice, move into art or revolutionary politics," he says. "I took the path of art at the age of 18, quote M. Today, I'm excited to welcome you to Becoming Gustav Metzger, Uncovering the Early Years 1945 to 1959. This is an event of our monthly virtual lecture series, Flight or Fight, Stories of Artists Under Repression. It is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Nicola Baird. After her presentation, we'll have time to ask questions, so please submit them in the chat function. Nicola Baird is the co-curator of the first museum exhibition to examine the little-known formative years of refugee artist and activist Gustav Metzger, which just opened at Ben-Uri Gallery and Museum in London and is on view until September 17, 2021. She's a research officer and curator at the Ben-Uri Research Unit of Ben-Uri Gallery and Museum, London. She's currently studying for a PhD in History of Art at London South Bank University in collaboration with Ben-Uri. As a guest curator at Burke House, she was the initiator of the Arts Council-funded exhibition, The Making of an Englishman, Fred Uhlmann, a retrospective, held at Burke House before touring to the Hatton Gallery, Newcastle in 2018, and editor of the accompanying publication. In 2019, she curated Czech Roots to Britain, selected Czechoslovak artists in Britain from the Ben-Uri private collections at Ben-Uri, and for which she edited the accompanying catalog. Welcome, Nicola Baird.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much for inviting me and for this opportunity to share with you the unknown early work of refugee artist, activist, and environmentalist Gustav Metzger. As Rachel mentioned, the subject of my lecture today is Becoming Gustav Metzger, Uncovering the Early Years, 1945 to 59, the title of an exhibition currently open and on view at Ben-Uri Gallery in London, the first museum exhibition to exclusively examine Metzger's little-known formative years prior to the development of his later radical autodestructive practice, for which he's better known. The exhibition showcases rarely seen drawings and paintings from this crucial early period, the majority never exhibited, along with related archival material, while a more extensive offering will also be available online at benuri.org, designed to showcase the breadth of Metzger's early work executed on conventional as well as unusual found supports, including paper, canvas, and board, as well as cardboard, plastic, and sheets of mild steel. Both the physical and the online exhibitions chart Metzger's artistic journey from figuration to abstraction, while simultaneously uncovering an intriguing episode in the artist's own personal narrative. The works on view have been selected from a large hoard of works that, for reasons unknown, Metzger hid from public view in the North London attic of a relative for 45 years, and rediscovered in 2009 on the eve of his solo exhibition at the Serpentine Gallery, before retrieving in November 2010. Their storage within a domestic context explains their often fragile and in some cases damaged material condition, which serves only to enrich their story of survival. Metzger rarely signed or dated his work, thus even establishing a conventional chronology is no simple task. Uncatalogued and under-researched, many of these works remain at this exciting stage in what is inevitably an ongoing process of discovery. Even questions relating to their correct orientation are not always easily answered. Yet together this body of work allow us to follow the artist's embryonic and highly exploratory journey towards becoming the Gustav Metzger of later fame. Now to delve into the artist's biography and to put a number of the works exhibited into context. Gustav Metzger was born in 1926 in Nuremberg, home to the second largest Jewish community in Bavaria. Many were recent arrivals from other parts of Europe, including Metzger's parents, Judah and Fanny, who had immigrated from Poland in 1918. After 1938, the situation for Jews in Nuremberg became insupportable, and beginning with the deportation of his father and sisters to Poland, Metzger's family began to disintegrate under the pressure of Nazi politics and practices. His mother voluntarily joined his father at a detention camp near the Polish-German border, while his sisters fled to Sweden, later immigrating to Israel. His parents and eldest brother perished in the years to come. As did his grandparents and many other close relatives. Metzger and his older brother Max, however, were rescued and sent to Britain as Polish citizens under the auspices of the refugee children's movement. They arrived in England along with 500 other refugee children on 12th of January 1939. They were initially housed in Butlin's holiday camp and subsequently in a hostel for refugee children in London. Metzger later recalled, "My first contact with Great Britain was arriving at Harwich from Holland by boat, and after a few weeks on the coast, we were transported to London by bus. My first experience of London was thousands of car lights as we passed through the traffic, something I had never seen before, coming from the relatively small town of Nuremberg." In 1941, Gustav and Max Metzger, along with the boys' school they attended in London, were evacuated to Hemel Hempstead in Hertfordshire. In September of that year, Metzger began a 3-year cabinetry course in Leeds, studying woodwork at a technical college set up by the Organisation for Rehabilitation Through Training and Œuvre de Secours aux Enfants, Children's Aid Society. Instruction ceased after a year due to heavy German bombing of the city, and yet, despite such a premature conclusion, his stay in Leeds proved crucial, for it was on visits to Temple Newsome House that he first encountered the work of Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth, as well as other leading modernists, including Graham Sutherland, Matthew Smith, Jacob Epstein, Paul Nash, John Piper, and Gaudia Brejka. After working in a furniture factory and workshop in and near Leeds, in 1944, Metzger moved to Clifton, Bristol, where he lived in a commune of Trotsky anarchists. Instead of becoming a professional revolutionary, he said, "I realized that utopia wasn't for me." He chose the way of art and sculpture, recalling, "It was a total commitment. When the decision was made, I knew that this would be forever. It was a kind of conversion, very sudden, in a way unexpected." In August of that year, whilst working in the organic garden at Champneys Nature Cure Clinic near Tring, Metzger began carving his first sculptures, strongly influenced by Barbara Hepworth and Henry Moore, from small pieces of Honiton stone, which he eventually had to leave behind because they couldn't be moved. Others, made in Cambridge from Portland stone, were small and figurative, reminiscent of Moore's work during the 1930s. Metzger approached Moore with a letter, and when they met at the National Gallery in London, asked the sculptor to take him on as his assistant. Moore recommended that he first attend life drawing classes. As a result, he spent about 6 months at the Cambridge School of Art before moving to London in 1945 and enrolling at the Sir John Cass Institute to study sculpture and drawing, and almost simultaneously in evening live classes at the Borough Polytechnic taught by British painter David Bomberg. In Metzger's own words, "I remember walking into the life room and there was a small man who looked sort of unprepossessing. It was David Bomberg. But within a few weeks, one realized that this was not an ordinary person. He was charismatic, had enormous experience, and he was, I think, a great artist." He recalls, "In 1945 to 46, when I entered the class, I was introduced to drawing that was completely different to what I'd been doing in Cambridge, which had involved following the outline of the figure to make a realistic interpretation." Bomberg said, "Forget about that. Go for the structure, go for the center and use the full weight of the body." Bomberg encouraged his students to work with the whole of the body. He emphasized it isn't just the hand, it's everything going through the entire system, which then is expressed on the page or on the canvas. This relates to abstract expressionism, to the American developments going on at the same time, and for Metzger, it was the beginning of a move towards the end result, towards dealing with the central, salient points of the figure, rather than with the detail, going to the heart of the matter. In the first 3 months, Metzger reflected, Bomberg got me involved in drawing in a way that was completely new to me. I gravitated towards ink in his class, nowhere else. I hadn't used it before, and there the inspiration was Gaudier. Describing this period as my Gaudier phase, he remembers that Bomberg was very intrigued by and encouraged by such work, which although not executed using Bomberg's technique, he could see I was doing fresh work and that was different to everybody else in the class, often completing 6 or perhaps even 10 drawings, always on big sheets of paper. Bomberg subsequently invited Metzger to join his painting and composition class, in addition to the evening life drawing class. Metzger later claimed, I never thought of painting. It never occurred to me. Recalling, so I started and it went very well. I was painting, using only oil on board, usually rather than canvas. I liked it. I preferred it. The paintings Metzger made in Bomberg's composition class, several of which are included in the exhibition, were all abstract. He remembers, I started off with a skeletal figure in the moonlight, which Bomberg touched with brownish paint, thought to be self-portrait and undefiled, which you can see on screen now, the title of which can be translated from the German inscription. Then I started on a very large work, and that was abstract, Dissolution of the City, also completed in 1946, which depicted the struggle between East and West London, influenced by Futurism, before completing another painting on a similar scale, depicting a movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, Eroica Funeral March, influenced by Kandinsky and his concern with music. Interestingly, Metzger recalls that Bomberg didn't like this painting. He said, you are more genuine than Kandinsky, and I can see what he meant. I was really putting everything in. Bomberg advised Metzger to apply for a grant offered by the Nathan and Adolf Handler charity, which would support his full-time studies for the next 2 years. Metzger reflected on his relationship with Bomberg. First of all, he was my teacher, and the one I was interested in more than any other. He always influenced the way I was painting or drawing. He was also a friend and a supporter. He worked with me, but also for me, and he became a form of father figure. There was a difference in age, but he was of Polish Jewish origin, just like my family. There was so much that brought us together, not only in relation to art and shared family history, but also in relation to politics. That was one reason we got on so well. Intuitively, he realized that I was interested in the same things he was interested in. During these early years in London, in addition to taking classes at the Sir John Cass Institute, the Borough Polytechnic, and the newly founded Anglo-French Art Centre in St John's Wood, Metzger also took the opportunity to spend time in the British Museum Library, studying a variety of topics, including embryology, which would subsequently feature heavily in his work. The heat of the summer of 1947 had forced Metzger to abandon outdoor sculptural work, confining his artistic activities to his East End studio shack off Commercial Road in East London, where he swapped carving for painting. I was intrigued by painting, and I did a series of paintings which are completely different to what I was doing with Bomberg. They were compositions inspired by embryology. Elaborating, he recalls, I would transpose embryonic images and circular images, concluding, this was my surrealist phase. Works were made using home-ground paint on boards which Metzger was able to pick up for nothing or next to nothing. One such work, his biggest to date, executed on tapestried tripartite room divider, was exhibited as Woman with Child the following year in a group show at Ben Urey Art Gallery's Portman Street premises in the spring exhibition of 1948, and subsequently at Bomberg's suggestion in the London group exhibition at Academy Hall under the revised title Hospital Mural, Womb Man, and priced at £40. Metzger was proud to remember that they really gave it a sort of special place, and it was special. It was my only triptych. Made with egg tempera, largely in black, white, and grey, he felt it was his best painting, for it was unlike anything that I'd done in Bomberg's class, and it was in a more circular form, and it was in monochrome. The other paintings were all rather colourful. It had a harmony. The series of paintings on board Metzger refers to from this period may also include 2 untitled paintings depicting contrasting and yet surreal encounters between male and female figures and seated women, tentatively dated 1945 to 47, now on screen. Metzger spent the summer of 1948 travelling on the continent. Having applied for a stateless rather than a Polish passport, believing it was more organic for me to be stateless than British, Polish, or Israeli, an affirmation of the past and an ongoing integration with the past, he set out on an art historical journey of sorts. He spent time in Holland, Belgium, and France before enrolling for a year at the Antwerp Art Academy, where he was taught by Belgian graphic artist and figurative painter Gustav de Bruyne. He had secured a grant to fund his studies in Antwerp through the city's Jewish community. And as a result, Metzger remembers drawing and painting from the model every day, and that in my spare time, I would spend hours and hours in the streets drawing children. I made hundreds of drawings on blue paper with pencil, influenced by the Renaissance, including portrait and head of a man on screen now. There he also completed the Expressionist paintings, Head, 1948, and Antwerp Model, 1949, both of which are included in the exhibition. The latter, one of Metzger's most arresting works of the period, depicts a conventional seated female figure, transgressively transformed, as art historian and curator Andrew Wilson has noted, into something half animal. He returned to Britain in the autumn of 1949 and spent the winter at the Oxford School of Art, now Oxford Brookes University, before resuming evening classes with Bomberg at the Borough Polytechnic. Although not a member of the Borough Group, it was from this point onwards that he developed a real closeness with Bomberg, attending his classes twice weekly until 1953. Bomberg urged his students to seek out and attend exhibitions in London as often as they could. As a pupil of Bomberg's, Metzger was granted free entry to the Leicester galleries, where he saw a lot of Epstein, whilst also frequenting Zwemer Gallery's bookshop and artist, author, and legendary bohemian Jack Bilbo's Modern Art Gallery on King Charles II Street. In fact, it was Epstein's support, by way of a letter of recommendation, that led to an extension of Metzger's Handler Trust grant for another year. His full-time study was therefore funded up until the end of 1950, the same year in which he executed a thickly painted portrait commissioned by its subject, Ernest Royalton Kish, the solicitor who facilitated Metzger's grants from the Handler Trust. Following the disintegration of the Borough Group in 1951, Metzger was also involved, together with fellow pupils of Bomberg, Cliff Holden and Miles Richmond, in arranging an exhibition for some of its former members, but in the end, work by Metzger was not included. That same year, Metzger completed a sequence of studies and finished paintings based on an ink drawing made in Antwerp, titled and dated Homage to a Starving Poet, 7th of April, 1949. The series relates to Metzger's memory, not long after he began attending Bomberg's classes, of having been warned by his teacher that if you want to be an artist, you must be prepared to starve. The number of works executed is also suggestive, as Andrew Wilson notes, of the importance that this subject had for him in reinforcing his own identity as both a refugee and an artist. To embrace such a willingness to suffer was an indication of his commitment to shoulder the responsibilities of being an artist. 3 of these studies, along with a number of the other works on display, would subsequently be exhibited at Metzger's retrospective, Paintings and Drawings, 1945 to 1960, at the Temple Gallery, London in 1960. As Wilson also observes, although one painting follows the drawing closely, the other paintings exchange the thin, jagged strokes of the pen for a lattice of short staccato brushstrokes that represent a group of 3 figures arranged in a triangular composition, with one figure to the side, echoing both depictions of the circumstances of Christ's crucifixion, as well as traditional representations of prophets, with followers or supplicants on either side. Bomberg's teaching then continued to be inspirational for Metzger, not only in practical terms, but also because of his belief in art's potential to act as a social force. For as Bomberg asserted, it is the example the artist gives of fulfilling himself in his work that is of social use to others. Also dating from this time are at least 2 life drawings, reclining nudes, one in charcoal and the other in black paint or watercolor, featuring what are thought to be Bomberg's corrections in orange chalk. In addition to the as yet unidentified head of Auerbach, 1952, listed among the works displayed as part of Metzger's Temple Gallery retrospective, as having been drawn by David Bomberg and Metzger. In the summer of 1953, Metzger was one of a small number of Bomberg's pupils who came together to form not a group, but a grouping of students who would exhibit together, known as the Borough Bottega. In Metzger's own words, the Bottega was largely my idea and was intended as a nice gesture and, if you like, a mark of my appreciation. Having taken the initiative with starting this new group, and as definitely its most active member, after class, Metzger would often accompany Bomberg on the bus back to Hampstead and would sometimes be invited into his house in Belsize Park, North London, where he would often get out from under his bed bundles of papers and press cuttings and encourage Metzger to get deeper into his chronology, his biography. At this point, Metzger began to think, well, somebody must write about him, and approached art historian, critic, and collector Douglas Cooper and Ukrainian-born editor and author Jacob Sontag, founder in 1953 of Jewish Quarterly, among others. The letter, dated 27th of April 1953, asked Cooper if he would be interested in writing a book on the work of David Bomberg, or in assisting with the organizing of a major retrospective exhibition of his work, and/or with the catalogue. Critic and curator Pontus Kyander believes the letter to Cooper gives important insight into the methods Metzger was absorbing from his teacher, quoting Metzger's assertions that one must be concerned not only with the model or the mountain, but also with the elements of the environment, including the world of the student while painting and drawing, and that the structure of the painting should be expressive as of a total realization as possible, and should be built with a minimum of conscious reflection. No more than 2 months after the letter to Cooper was written, Metzger decided that he would write what he referred to as a treatise on Bomberg, at which point Metzger approached critic Herbert Reed, among others, for relevant information. By this time, he had moved out of London, passing his studio near Mornington Crescent on to Leon Kossoff, who subsequently passed it on to Frank Auerbach, both pupils of Bomberg's, also at the Borough Polytechnic. Commuting from Kings Lynn in Hertfordshire, Metzger recalls that sometimes I travelled 50 miles to get to his class. indicative of the fact that I was fully committed and reconciled to the relationship of teacher and student. This was a relationship, however, that was soon to become very complicated. Metzger's opposition to the Bottega's first exhibition, giving too much space to Bomberg and his closest family, resulted in his resignation from the group. In Metzger's own words, "You rebel against the father and you rebel against the teacher." That was part of it. He felt that having put all that effort in to building up Bomberg as far as I could, and taking part in the first exhibition, which took place at the Berkeley Galleries, and in which Metzger exhibited 2 works, Model and Clown, both listed as oils and priced at 50 guineas, as well as expressing the desire to organise exhibitions in Oxford and Cambridge. I saw that although we had a constitution, that the central aim is in fact to help Bomberg, I could see that David and Lillian Bomberg weren't satisfied. He reflects that it was evident that they wanted more, and I felt that that was incompatible with the aims of the Bottega and my own position. Despite resigning from the group, Metzger made it clear to Bomberg that he would still be very happy to continue working with him. A few weeks later, however, he received a letter out of the blue in which Bomberg unexpectedly and unceremoniously cut all ties with his former favoured pupil. "Thinking I could help you was a mistake. In trying, I have done myself little honour and earned a great deal of damage. You should have been content with the amount of interest and helpfulness the other students were given. It was your duty to see that you did not exceed this, and I did not realise the implications, the injustices I was doing, and the havoc I was performing whilst I was being kind to you. Your resignation from the Borough Bottega is according to your own thinking and needs no comment from me." The shock of having received such a letter and the betrayal it involved, addressed to Metzger's home in Kings Lynn, Norfolk, may have precipitated an almost 3-year period in which he didn't paint, though during which time he did apply to be a member of the Ben-Uri Gallery. By 1956, however, he felt ready to begin again. Painting, rather than drawing, increasingly abstract figures. A female figure in green-grey is almost impossible to pick out of the gloom in one of 2 major canvases, Girl at Bus Window, 1956. For Metzger, of course, the paintings of this period all relate to Bomberg, but they're all different to the work I was doing with Bomberg. They're rather thin painted, and also the paintings are rather different from each other. He revealed the fact, too, that there weren't many. I would spend weeks on each one. Bomberg's influence is evident in Metzger's approach to such compositions, and to some extent his dealing with colour, though he tended towards a far darker palette than his teacher. The structural attack he learned from Bomberg is still visible, and yet the speed of attack in his paintings from 1956 was emphasized by his decision to paint with a palette knife. Prior to his relocation to Norfolk, he had painted with brushes almost entirely, but in Kings Lynn he began to paint only with a palette knife. Almost simultaneously, he started to engage himself in local environmental issues and the emerging anti-nuclear movement. Additional influences on his work at this time included contemporary art magazines, modern and contemporary art exhibitions. I would go to art galleries in London, including the ICA and the Whitechapel Gallery, visiting the 1956 This Is Tomorrow exhibition repeatedly, as well as the Metavisual Tachist Abstract Painting in England Today, a pivotal 1957 exhibition at the Red Fern Gallery. Composed almost exclusively of works of painterly abstraction by Peter Lanyon, Patrick Heron, Ben Nicholson, and Sandra Blow, amongst others, it was an exhibition in which Metzger felt his work might find a place. He showed 2 works, including Girl at Bus Stop, to Red Fern's director, Rex Nankerville. They were not accepted, however, angering Metzger and provoking an emotional response, which resulted in what would be a long a lifelong rejection of the Bond Street dealer system. Also dating from 1956 are paintings and a much greater quantity of drawings, many in coloured chalks, depicting a three-legged occasional table, 4 of which are included in the exhibition. Such works might be seen to reflect Metzger's increasingly anti-nuclear sentiment, and yet about this series of paintings he has also suggested a connection to the Tablet of Moses. Of his religious upbringing and its effect on his artistic practice, Metzger reflected, "I was raised in a Jewish orthodox environment, so there was a fascinating clash in my youth between art and the Jewish insistence on the prohibition on images. This is at the center of my work. On the one hand, opening up to the world, and on the other, closing off from it. I arrived in Britain as a refugee when I was 12 years old, so it never came to the point of choosing between art and tradition, because by the time I would have been faced with such choices, I had already left my hometown and gone in a completely new direction." He has also spoken, however, in conversations with author and curator Brona Ferren, of grappling for years with the central question, how might a Jewish person make art? As well as the ways in which he was circling Judaism with respect to making images of the human figure. Such statements relate in interesting ways to a series of drawings thought to relate from 1945 to 46, in varying sizes and styles, of a family seated around a table, which Metzger asserted represented his own family, as well as one of his earliest memories of being bathed as a child by his mother. By the 1950s, Metzger had begun to incorporate new methods and materials into his practice, successfully experimenting with painting on alternative, often found materials, including cardboard and plastic, as well as sheets of mild steel collected in London. He describes the decision to paint on steel as an inevitable development, realizing his desire to work with something harder, more resilient. Those which he refers to in an interview with art writer, curator, and librarian Clive Philpott as his final paintings, were executed on 2 large oblong sheets of steel, one in red and the other in blue. Across the painted and incised surface of the latter, which is on screen now, intuitively and at random, he added white chalk, reflecting later, "Certainly I was aware that it would smudge off, and that wouldn't matter. A trace of the chalk would be there." He asserts, "I didn't paint again because there I summed up my capacities and my interest in painting. The chalk is the end and the beginning of the next phase of painting. And yet there are a small number of later paintings on found plywood boxes used to contain Kodak photographic paper, 2 of which are included in the exhibition. However, which because of the visibility of inspection markings are likely dated to circa 1961 to 62. 2 paintings on mild steel and an earlier painting on board featured in 3 paintings. An exhibition of Metzger's work at 14 Monmouth Street, London, a coffee shop for artists run by Welsh kinetic artist Brian Robbins in August 1959, marking Metzger's return to London. Michael Bullock, writing in the accompanying handout, explained that Metzger paints the world as it is seen under the influence of speed. Speed has a curious effect on objects. It draws them out, distorting their shape, throwing into relief certain aspects of their form, and causing other elements to vanish altogether. Such speed is reflective of Metzger's long-held desire, as expressed to Bomberg in 1946, for painting to be fast and intense, as well as to his experience of Bomberg's classes, in which students were encouraged to draw and to paint energetically in upright strokes as a result of their mentor's gift to the class, the energy being presented and magically drawn out into the room. In June 1960, Metzger had returned to his studio in Kings Lynn to develop his ideas of a radical auto-destructive art practice by means of painting with hydrochloric acid on sheets of nylon. While former pupil and Borough Group member Roy Oxlade believed that all that side of Metzger's work, which subsequently developed into his auto-destructive vision, is absolutely alien to Bomberg's teaching, and must, I think, be seen as an aberration. Metzger disagreed. There is a fundamental relationship between myself as a favorite pupil of Bomberg and my ongoing development as an artist, including my paintings in Kings Lynn, which was, of course, a direct continuation, including my first acid action painting at the Temple Gallery, in particular, where you can see the brushstrokes could be by Bomberg or by one of his central pupils. The maintenance of such an affinity with Bomberg, his teaching, his practice, and his maxims are for Metzger to be expected, explaining that spending 8 years of your youth with one person who dominates you, who is dominant, but who you almost merge with, inevitably resulted in his continuing the rest of my life under the influence of Bomberg, and it affected the techniques I used and the manner I used them in, and the ideals I have on art, and the relationship to society, especially in terms of responsibility, which undoubtedly was a central feature. Musing, Metzger perceived the situation much later. All those years of my being a student, starting in January 1945, I asked myself how art can contribute to saving society, to changing society. Having come to the fundamental belief that art should have the power to influence other people and influence the world. As recently as 1995, Metzger suggested to Wilson that Bomberg's aphorism, the search for the spirit in the mass, could still be applied to much of his own work. And yet his foundation and creation of decades worth of auto-destructive art goes way beyond Bomberg. Indeed, this is the point young artists have to go beyond their masters. Thank you very much. I'd just like to say, before handing back over to Rachel, that we have an exhibition catalogue to accompany the exhibition. I don't know if you can see that, which is available to buy online. And that we will be having a series of exhibitions also featuring much more work available to view at benuri.org very soon. And the details are up on the screen now of the exhibition and the website, where you can also book for upcoming events in the series that I've organised relating to Gustav Metzger's early work. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicola. This was a fascinating talk, and now we'll open the event to questions. So please post your questions in the Q&A or the chat function. And I believe Liane Dmytrenko, the curator, is in the audience. So I hope she'll be able to answer questions as well. So David is asking, could you elaborate a little bit on Metzger's relationships to the better known students of Bomberg, like Lucian Freud, Auerbach, Kossoff, and so on?
Yeah, well, I suppose that the main thing was that they were all students at the same time, particularly Kossoff and Auerbach. Beyond that, I don't think they really did have relationships with each other. I mean, Metzger did portray Auerbach on a couple of occasions. As I mentioned, there was a work in his 1960 exhibition, a retrospective that he himself organised that included a work ahead of Frank Auerbach by Metzger and Bomberg, and we think that work is one that we've included in the exhibition at Ben-Uri, but it is subject to debate. Yeah, so and apart from the fact that he also passed on his studio, as I mentioned, to Kossoff and then to Auerbach. But aside from that, I don't think there is really a relationship, particularly with their work specifically.
Is that the studio that Auerbach is still in?
Yes, yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I know. Love to be able to visit him there.
Yes, well, we are. That is quite. I mean, isn't it somehow strange that there was no closer relationship, because Auerbach came also on the Kindertransport, so they were kind of all in the same situation. I don't know about Lucian Freud and Kossoff. Did they also come on the Kindertransport? I'm not sure.
I'm not sure that Freud was a pupil of Bomberg's, actually, but
okay.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose any other similarities would be in terms of the thick texture. The portrait that I showed of Ernest Royalton Kitsch is quite thickly painted, especially in the face area, and obviously Auerbach is well known for his thickly painted works, and to some extent the use of kind of dark colors in that 50s period. But they then went on to do such different things, and as hopefully you've been able to see from some of the slides, and as you will be able to see more from the online exhibitions on view soon, the range of Metzger's work from this early period is just so vast. And as he said, he was doing, different things to what other people were doing in Bomberg's classes. He had this Gaudier Brejka phase, and he was using ink, and then he had this surreal phase, and so I think whilst Bomberg, was a huge influence on Metzger and his practice throughout his life, that there were stylistic differences even early on.
Yeah. So did Bomberg? I mean, Metzger mentioned that Bomberg was a lifelong influence on him, and of course I can see that, as 8 years in youth would influence your whole outlook on life, especially if your parents and your family is not around. But did Bomberg see that the same way? Was he proud of him as a student, or?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, until the sort of falling out moment, which was in '53, they were very close, and especially in the very late '40s and early '50s, Bomberg was very much taking Metzger under his wing, and not only with his work, but encouraging him to also pursue Bomberg's own chronology and work on exhibitions with him. And obviously he was, Metzger himself was very influential in the forming of this group around Bomberg, which he was obviously very supportive of, the Borough Bottega, which which he then resigned from, obviously, but yeah, I think he would have seen the fact that they were close as well. Yeah.
Right. So Robert is actually clarifying Lucian Freud definitely was not on the Kindertransport. I think his father, the architect Ernst Freud, was in the UK from 1933. And he also says it was a Warner's camp, I think, and not a Woodlands camp at Dovercourt Bay near Harwich, pronounced Harwich. Okay, the W is silent, where Kindertransport children were initially placed when they arrived in the UK. Do you know more where he was placed? I believe they were placed in different camps, no?
Yeah, I mean, that may be correct. So thank you for that information. But I mean, the only information I have here is that when they were sent to Britain, they arrived and were initially housed in Butlins holiday camp, and then subsequently in a hostel in London.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't elaborate any more on that at this moment, but
Yeah.
I'll definitely look into it.
There seems to be a lot of research on Kindertransports right now, and children are coming into the UK and also coming into the US. So hopefully, if that hasn't been researched, maybe with this big research effort, this more information about that will come out. You mentioned that he came, Metzger came with his brother. Did they stay in touch? Were they close to each other, or how was that?
Yes, yeah, they were initially very close, and both took up the calling of art making. They both wanted to be sculptors. They both went to Leeds initially, and they both attended the Cambridge School of Art and subsequently the Sir John Cass Institute, where they studied sculpture and drawing. And Max also did attend Bomberg's classes as well. So they were close for a while. When Metzger traveled to Europe, that was also with Max, but he stayed on, I believe, on the continent whilst Metzger returned to London. So yeah, they were definitely very close. I believe they then sort of drifted apart due to the fact they weren't living in the same place. But yeah, I wonder if Leanne, if she's listening, has any more to contribute on that.
I don't see her commenting here. Ronak said, comments, Kosov was of course London born. He was from a Russian Jewish immigrant background. So
yeah.
Slowly that information is rolling in. So I also read that his sisters, Metzger's sisters, came to England via Sweden. So 2 sisters survived as well. Was there a relationship, or?
Yeah, his sisters. Let me just check. Yes, his sisters fled to Sweden and later immigrated to Israel. Yeah, they may have come to London in the intervening time. I'm not sure. I think Leanne has commented back there.
Yes, she says Max became an art historian subsequently. So he joined the other side.
Yeah, yeah. They definitely shared, many interests and.
Yeah.
She's also.
Yeah.
She said something about his sisters.
Yeah, and Leanne says, no, I don't believe his sisters did ever travel to the UK.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, so probably there was not much of a.
Yeah, I don't know how much of a connection there was. Yeah, something to be shed more light on there.
Yes. So did Metzger later on, when he did this big shift in his art making, did he also exhibit in Germany? Did he have a big name in Germany for the art he made? Because I think I can only imagine that it resonated very much with people's experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I believe he did exhibit in Germany, definitely in his later life. I don't believe he did during this early period that I'm looking at. And I don't think he'd sort of even gone back during that period. But definitely much later in his career, he absolutely had shows in Germany.
Yeah. Actually, Robert writes back. Thank you so much, Robert. You're shedding a lot of light on different questions. My husband's aunt, Miriam Mayer, a pupil at Anna Esslinger's school at Bundscourt, in its UK incarnation, greeted the Kindertransport children when they arrived with Anna Esslinger. Her sister, the artist Eva Altburg, who has pictures in Ben Urey collection, knew Auerbach and had pictures by Kossoff. So that's
thank you. Yeah, fascinating.
That's where the whole, I think, the circle closes, I guess. Very, very interesting. So, Metzger never married, right?
No. Yeah. I mean, I've been able to look into this a tiny bit through interviews that he conducted with Clive Philpott, who I mentioned in my talk. And during those, he does discuss this subject, and he was conflicted at one point in his early years, and definitely made work sort of relating to kind of relationships between men and women, including paintings and a particular sculpture that he was working on, that there's no kind of photographic evidence of because it was actually destroyed at the time, but on a building site opposite the St. John Cass Institute that was about two figures kind of intertwined. But he then, I believe, came to kind of the realization that he wasn't going to be able to commit to both things in a way, and if he wanted to put his all into art making, then he was going to have to sacrifice the the kind of relationships and family side of things. But yeah, I mean, I assume it can't have been an easy decision, and it was something he thought about a lot. And I suppose it can be seen reflected in the fact that he also made this series of work, which I mentioned, relating to embryonic kind of images and things like that, which he studied in the British Museum Library. I guess that must have been a kind of reflection on that kind of thing as well. But yeah, I don't know if Leanne or any of the other listeners have anything to comment on that, but that's kind of what I know and what I gleaned from interviews that he gave during his lifetime.
Yeah, I actually I was fascinated looking a little bit into his work in preparation of this talk. How much values, ethic and moral values that he must have gotten through his religious upbringing, he carried throughout his life. He, in a way, he was a very, very Jewish artist in terms of his values and the conflicts that he had with for example, with depicting the figure, and so it almost seems as if he's holding on to his roots by making it, making these values such a big part of his art making, and also, later on, his concern for the environment, against against war, against all these political those things that were politically important to him, resonate a lot of I think a lot of his Jewish roots. What do you think?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I think the trauma obviously resulting from having escaped Nuremberg and his family, many of them perishing, definitely resonated and it can be seen kind of to echo throughout his career, and as you say, that holding on very deeply to a concern for the past, and how important that was. And he was a deeply kind of principled and caring person in terms of being an activist and environmentalist, and caring a lot about destruction and extinction, and trying to prevent those things and shine a light on those things as much as possible. So I would agree with you there.
Yeah, true. So David says Bomberg was, if I see this correctly, someone who brought the figure forcefully and somehow defiantly back into modernism and spawned part of the London School. Do you think that Metzger's move into more abstract territory was part of the rift between him and Bomberg?
I'm not sure, because I mean, he does say that he was making abstract work during the time that he was close with Bomberg. So I wouldn't necessarily say that's the case. What really did mark the shift when he'd split from Bomberg was the not using the brush anymore and using his fingers and the palette knife, and yeah, from the sort of table series and more, yeah, I guess more sort of geometric style abstract works. But he could be considered to have been working abstractly before then, just not quite in the same vein. So yeah, I mean, the break with Bomberg did obviously precipitate a number of things and a number of changes in his practice, but I wouldn't necessarily say a move away from the figure was one of those, because he did feel that, for example, that girl at Hunstanton painting that I showed you, very dark painting, he, you know, whilst to the viewer it does look abstract, he definitely perceived that to be a figurative painting, and painted others similar to that, or at least one other similar to that at the time. So, and that was in the late 50s, several years after his break with Bomberg. So,
yeah. So we have two more questions, which is perfectly within our timing. Marty is asking, how did Metzger come to believe that art can change the larger society when an understanding of his artwork's meaning requires what might be called an elitist art education?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear the last part of the question.
How did Metzger come to believe that art can change the larger society when an understanding of his artwork's meaning requires what might be called an elitist art education?
I mean, he came to the realization that art could change society quite early on, because he, you know, in the early 40s even was immersed in kind of radical literature and was looking at Eric Gill and other Marxist writers. And initially that's where the tussle was between being revolutionary and being an artist. But I think he saw them coming together even then. I wouldn't necessarily agree that his work requires an elitist education, though I take that as an interesting point. I mean, I think especially his later work, which is not the subject of this talk or the exhibition, but that was very much big statements relating, you know, to revolutionary kinds of things. And I would have thought that he would have felt those were quite immediate and obvious points from the kind of destructive work that began with the aceton nylon to sort of bigger happenings and projects involving cars and fumes and newspapers and things like that. So, but yeah, I don't know if
right,
that answered the question.
Of course. So the questions keep coming in, or the comments. So Warnock says, Gustav lived together with a person named Cordula in the mid-1980s. I've seen a picture of them together at the Staatsgalerie in Stuttgart in 1986. So that kind of hints at, goes beyond your period of research, but kind of answers part of the question that I asked you. So, and Robert says a big influence on Bomberg was his visits to Jerusalem during the British Mandate in the 1920s. Gill was never a Marxist, but an ardent Roman Catholic convert. So that's those are the two comments. And now I have the final question by Stephanie. What brought Metzgara's work to you? What went into your decision to write about him?
Oh, yeah, thanks for that question. Metzger had been someone that I was thinking about for a while. I saw him speak at St. Martin's, and I think it was 2012, along with London Fieldworks, who worked on a project with him called Null Object. And Joe is actually going to be speaking at one of our August events, actually, so check that out. But yeah, I think from that time he kind of was in my mind, and then I was thinking about doing a symposium and approached the foundation, and initially was thinking then a few years ago about just the drawings kind of from this Bomberg period, and exhibiting them in the at LSBU, which was the Borough Polytechnic, where he obviously had lessons with Bomberg. And then yeah, the project really evolved, and Ben Uri gave me the amazing opportunity to bring Metzger there, and I felt that it was important to show the early work rather than the mid or later work, which is also kind of quite difficult to show within a small space and requires recreating and things. So yeah, it sort of evolved over a few years, but really delighted with the opportunity to be able to have the exhibition at Ben Uri. And as I said, we will have a larger online offering also available on the Ben Uri website in due course. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Yeah, and actually Ben Uri is doing quite some groundbreaking work in installing a virtual itself as a virtual museum, so expanding from their physical space into larger virtual offerings. So I personally find that very, very interesting. And
absolutely, yeah, there are a lot of online exhibitions available to view at benuri.org. So
yeah. Thank you so much, Nicola, for your work on behalf of Gustav Metzger, and for sharing with us your insights into the artist's life and work. Stay healthy, everyone, and be well, and stay in touch. Goodbye. Thank you.